Hey guys, and welcome to another edition of Rika Soccer Beat. I'm your host, Jeremy Rika, and I would love to welcome you back. Today we're going to talk about something that I think should really be discussed because it's something that I deal with almost on a yearly basis. It's something that I think some kids are ready for and some kids are not. I'm talking about making that jump from recreational soccer to club soccer. Now, it may not seem like a big deal because, like I said in my last video, look, at the end of the day, going from recreational soccer to the club soccer level is definitely a part of moving up the chain of command, if you will. It's something that we all have to do as soccer players if we want to move on to bigger and better things. But the question is, how do we make that jump? And how do we make that transition easier for these kids? Because the reality is, I've seen people on both ends of the spectrum where it's easier for some people and sometimes making that transition is not as easy. I mean, you have to remember that some of these kids, especially at the rec level, they never played soccer before. Maybe they get good enough to where, it's a diamond in the rough type of situation and they go from rec soccer to club soccer. It doesn't always happen, but it does happen. So I'm curious to know, how do you make that transition better? Because in reality, I've seen cases where, it's hard for some of these kids to adjust to having practices 3 times a week. It's hard practicing till 8:30 at night and going home and doing homework. It's hard for them to adjust to that. So I'm really curious to know, how do you guys make it easier? Is there a way to make it easier, or do you have the philosophy of, well, you know what you were getting into because I explained it to you in the very beginning that this is the way things were going to be, and I told you that what my expectations were? Or do you take your time with these people? Because that's the reality of it, is that it's very hard to get kids to buy into what we are doing at the club level, especially if you're just coming from rec soccer where, you go to practice once a week for an hour, you get your snack, you go to your games, you play your games, and you get your snack. I mean, yeah, there's times where, they have 2 games on the weekend and they have the occasional tournament if they're lucky. But most times they don't have to deal with that. And so it's very difficult for these kids to come into this with that, you know, oh, I'm going from this to practicing 3 days a week and traveling and getting a hotel and playing in tournaments and, doing all this. So I mean, how do you guys make that transition easier? I mean, for me, I think you gotta take baby steps with these kids because, it's not going to be as easy as, okay, I explained it to you, now go and do it. I mean, the reality is that just does not happen. It will never happen. You're not going to get a lot of these kids to buy into your system right away. And I think there's definitely a learning curve with some of these kids that are in their first year of competitive soccer. You can tell that the dedication isn't there. You can tell that it's a learning experience for them, and you can definitely separate the people that are able to do it from the people that are not able to do it. So I'm curious to know what you guys think because I think it's a very difficult thing to do. I think a lot of good players come from rec soccer. And I think that, the problem is that a lot of these kids get lost that are really good because some of these clubs, they just don't have the room to put some of these kids on their team. And I think that's a big issue in the world of youth soccer is that there's so many good players, but there's only 16 or so spots that we can take during tryouts. So, I think bringing people in straight from the rec soccer is really difficult, especially because you're only given a certain amount of spots. And part of the problem is, going into it, that the level of talent just isn't going to be there right away. So do you take the chance and bring in these kids from rec soccer? That's what I want to know. And if you do take the chance on these kids, how do you approach these kids to get them to buy into your system? Because that's a very hard thing to do, and some of them can make great soccer players. I've had kids that are on my team now that came from rec soccer and are at my club that are very, very good, to the point that they worked their way from the B team to the A team and they're doing very well. But there are also those kids that they come in and they just can't handle everything that goes into, the club soccer scene. And unfortunately, you see that quite a bit because some of these kids don't have what it takes to be a good club soccer player. It's just a fact, and that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I realize that not every one of the players that I take are going to make it at the club level. I mean, you have to have a certain amount of realistic expectations when it comes to bringing in kids that are just making the jump from the recreational level to the club soccer scene. So I'm curious to know from you guys, how do you deal with that issue? And what is your technique? Is it easier for you to deal with that issue? Is it harder to deal with those kind of players? I want to know what you guys think because it's something that I see every single year, and I think it's something that is really important because obviously the future of the sport comes from children. That's just the reality. It's kids that pave the way into great soccer players when they turn into to adults. So I'm very curious on how you guys approach that situation, even if you're not a coach. If you were, how would you approach that situation? So that's it for me, guys. If you have anything to add to this discussion, please post it down in the comments below. If you like the channel, please subscribe. Please turn on post notifications. And I will see you in the next video. Until next time, guys, I'm Jeremy Rika saying bye-bye.